Please welcome Medea Benjamin.
Thank you so much. Wow, this works, huh? Well, first of all, Mike Fox and PDA, amazing organizers, put this together, this Florida tour together in about 10 days' time. And also, thank you so much, Carol, for this beautiful space, and Tom, for your work. And Carol, when you talked about free thinkers, and oh, I guess it's gone, the free thinking, it made me think about a young Saudi man, and I thought I'd start out maybe telling you about him and dedicating tonight to thinking about him. His name is Raif Badawi, and he's creator of a blog called Free Saudi Liberals. A young man with 3 children, he wrote with sarcasm and humor about the need for free thinkers in the Arab world. He called for a separation of religion and state, spoke enthusiastically about the Arab Spring, warned against extremism, and advocated for liberalism. He made no calls for violence. He simply said Saudis should not be hemmed in by religious ideologies or fear, but should be, quote, champions in accepting the beliefs of others. For that, he was arrested in 2012 on charges that included insulting Islam through electronic channels. He was originally sentenced to death, a sentence that was later commuted to 10 years in prison, 1,000 lashes, and a fine of over $250,000. The first 50 lashes were administered in January 2015. Thanks to the international outcry, the remaining lashes were postponed. But as of today, he still remains in prison. So let us think of that young man with 3 young children and how all he wanted was to call for free thinking. I've done a lot of work in the Middle East, traveled to many countries in the Middle East, and my heart breaks, like probably many of you, when you see the violence that has consumed the Middle East. Much of it that would never have existed if George Bush had never invaded Iraq. But here we are today, and how do we undo this mess? And I realized as I traveled to the Middle East time and again that there was no way that we were going to undo the violence, deal with the extremism that spread way beyond the Middle East, if we didn't deal with the issue of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the great ally of the United States. And the more I learned about Saudi Arabia, the more appalled I am that this is our ally. You know, you hear a lot of politicians, and especially during election time, they say, that country, Iran, that Iran is spreading extremism all over the world. It's not Iran that is spreading extremism all over the world. It's Saudi Arabia, the great ally of the United States. We know that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. We know that there were all kinds of ties between the hijackers and people back home in Saudi Arabia. We know that there were 140 Saudis that were whisked out of this country just days after 9/11 to protect them. And we know that Saudi Arabia was born out of an ideology of extremism. Now, I don't want you to take the critique I have of Saudi Arabia as part of the growing and dangerous Islamophobia that people like Donald Trump are spreading around this country. Because the vast majority of Muslims in the world practice a very tolerant, peaceful, and loving form of Islam. Right, let's clap for him. But there is an exception, and that is Wahhabism. That's the intolerant, extremist, anti-Western, hatred-filled type of ideology that came at the very foundations of the nation of Saudi Arabia, with a pact between El Saud from the Saudi family and the Imam Wahhab, who came up with this crazy ideology. Now, it would have been in the dustbin of history a long time ago, along with the El Saud family, if it hadn't been for the discovery of oil. So the combination of a crazy imam with a terrible ideology, a Saud family that wanted lots of power, and oil that gave them the money to do this. Oh, and yes, there's another piece to that. A pact with the United States to provide them with protection. You put all those together and you get this very toxic mix. So let's go back and look at the founding of the nation of Saudi Arabia. They discover oil. The U.S. comes in and says, we need that oil. And that was especially true in 1945 during World War II. Franklin Delano Roosevelt goes to Saudi Arabia and says, we will make a deal with you. You give us the oil, we will protect you. That relationship has been carried out through Democratic presidents, Republican presidents, 12 different presidents, and remains to this day. Some of you might remember the very cozy relationship that George Bush Sr. and Jr. had with the Saudi regime. But Barack Obama has also had a very cozy relationship with the Saudi regime. And if I don't remember, remind me to talk about the relationship that Hillary Clinton has with the Saudi regime. So this has gone on for decades now. Well, let's take a look at what this regime is that we have become so entwined with. This is a regime where it is absolutely illegal to have any political party, where it is absolutely illegal to have any kind of open dissent and organizing against the government, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly. I gave the case of Raif Badawi. He is just one of so many Saudis who are rotting away in prison right now. This is to say nothing of the Saudis who have been beheaded because they have questioned the government. Non-violent dissidents get beheaded in Saudi Arabia, oftentimes in public squares, like in the capital city, in a place that's been nicknamed Chop Chop Square. And we wonder where the ideology for ISIS comes from, or where Al-Qaeda comes from. It comes from the very basis of the regime of Saudi Arabia. There are many ways that you can be put to death in Saudi Arabia for many reasons. Being a homosexual can get you the death penalty. Insulting Islam can get you the death penalty. Spreading atheism can get you the death penalty. Doing what they call sorcery, whatever that means, can get you the death penalty. Saudi Arabia has one of the highest rates of death penalty in the world. You look at an issue like freedom of religion. One would think that in a country that's a theocracy, it's based on religion, that it would recognize the right for all people to practice their religion. Not the case. There is freedom of religion if you believe in Wahhabism. If you are a Muslim that believes in the more liberal, tolerant, free-thinking form of Islam, like Sufi, you would not be allowed to openly express your religion. If you are part of the minority Shia, they have been discriminated against since the founding of Saudi Arabia, perhaps because the Shia live in the eastern part of the country where all the oil is. And the Saudis family, the royal family, has been desperately afraid all of these years that the Shia would rise up and break away and form an alliance perhaps with neighboring Iran, which is a Shia country. And so they have repressed the Shia minority constantly. Now, there are many, many people in Saudi Arabia who are not Muslim. Anybody know why? Immigrant workers. Yes, Tom. Immigrant workers. Because the Saudi nation has not been physically built up by the Saudi people. The Saudi people prefer to get cushy government jobs where they make a very decent living without doing a lot of work. So who is going to work in the hot sun to build all the high-rise buildings and build the infrastructure in this desert nation? Who is going to take care of the children of the Saudis? Who is going to clean their homes? Migrant workers. And they're coming from poor countries all over the world, like India, like Pakistan, Bangladesh, coming from African nations. They come on the basis of a very, very restrictive system where they need a sponsor to get into the country. But many of them are not Muslims. In fact, 2 million of them are Christians. They are not allowed to build a church. It's the only country in the world where it's illegal to build a church. Imagine that. Until 2004, if you were Jewish, you couldn't even go into Saudi Arabia. Obviously, you can't build a synagogue in Saudi Arabia. And you know, the U.S. government is made up of Congress people and people in the White House who are all religious, right? When they're running for office, they are suddenly very, very religious. Even Donald Trump reads the Bible more than anybody else, although he can't quote you anything from it. But here we are, a nation with all these religious people. And these religious people passed a law back in the 1990s that said, we will not tolerate countries that abuse the rights of people to practice whatever religion they want. And we will do a study every year paid for by Congress that will look at which are the worst countries. And you know what we're going to do to those bad countries? We're going to impose some kind of sanctions on them. So every year, we taxpayers pay for a study. And every year, guess which is one of the countries that always comes out on the bottom of the list? Saudi Arabia. Are there sanctions imposed on Saudi Arabia? Not at all. And you know why? Because in 2004, the State Department, and the State Department, you know, is the diplomatic arm of our government, the State Department said, we are going to give a waiver to the poor Saudis. Not only will we give a waiver, we will give an indefinite waiver to the poor Saudis. And we're going to push them to be more tolerant. And we're going to tell them to stop using the books that they use in schools that are filled with hatred towards anybody that doesn't practice their form of religion. And we'll tell them to please stop spreading the extremist ideology. But we're going to give them a waiver because we really don't want to sanction them. So every year, they get a free pass, even though they're one of the worst countries in terms of allowing people to practice their own religion. I mentioned, well, Tom mentioned the migrant labor. Millions of Saudis, in fact, there are non-Saudis, they can't be Saudi citizens, millions of migrant workers who work in Saudi Arabia, cannot get Saudi citizenship. They come, I mentioned, on a sponsorship program. A sponsorship program means you have to get a Saudi national to become your sponsor, and then they are in charge of you. You cannot change employer because you're being mistreated. No, that you are in the country only to work for that employer unless that employer decides you're going to work for someone else, and then whether or not you want to do that, you are automatically transferred to that other person. People in Saudi Arabia, the migrant workers, are abused every single day in all kinds of ways. These young women who come in from other countries, sexually abused by these very religious Saudi men in whose homes they are working. They are beaten. I want to read you just a couple of the horrendous things that I found when I was doing this research that the Saudi employers have done. For example, doctors in Sri Lanka operated on a 49-year-old woman to remove 24 nails her Saudi employers had hammered into her hands, legs, and forehead. after she complained about being overworked. In 2015, a domestic worker from India tried to flee after she was consistently denied pay and barely given enough to eat. Her employer locked her inside the house, inside her room. She tried to escape by climbing out a window using her sari as a rope. Her employer then hacked off her hand. She fell from the 3rd floor, breaking her spine. A video emerged of her lying in a Saudi hospital bed and was shown on television back home in India and sparked rioting, where the government was forced to put a ban, a hold on Indian women going to work in Saudi Arabia. Saudi is the most gender-segregated country in the world. You've probably heard something about the treatment of Saudi women. And this gender segregation, as well as these very extremist kind of laws, are enforced by not the regular police, they're enforced by the religious police. There are religious police. Do you remember when the U.S. invaded Afghanistan because the Taliban were so extremist? And the Taliban had these committees for the elimination of vice and the propagation of virtue. These same committees exist in Saudi Arabia. These religious police have committed tremendous abuses. They've been infamous over the years. They once beat a man to death for having alcohol in his home. They kept a woman in solitary confinement for sitting alone in the back of a taxi. They raided a private home to arrest a priest for celebrating Mass. One of the worst tragedies was in 2002 when an accidental fire broke out in a girls' school. The religious police stopped the girls from leaving the burning building because they were not wearing their abayas, the black outer garment. When the girls ran back inside the building to get their garments, many suffocated and 15 of them died. So you have a country that has imposed gender segregation. Women are forced to wear abayas. They are forced to be separated from men in McDonald's. There's McDonald's, there's Starbucks in Saudi Arabia, but there's a separate place for the women and a separate place for the men. Now, women have made a lot of strides in recent years in Saudi Arabia, and I want to acknowledge that. And that's particularly true around education. Saudi women now get public education. It used to be that the religious people said, all right, we'll let them get education. It's definitely segregated schools, but we also want them to just learn about the Quran and about how they could be good wives. And women fought against that, and they said, no, we want the same curriculum as the boys get. And they have almost reached that point now. And they have certainly made a lot of gains in being able to go to university. There's segregated universities for women, but now the majority of young people in schools are women. So women are getting a good education. Some of them are even going abroad to study. But then they come back to Saudi Arabia or after they get the education, and then they realize how hard it is for them to get work, because of all the other kinds of restrictions. Now, one of the big restrictions is they don't have the right to drive. It's the only country in the world where women don't have the right to drive. And it's not because there's a new car and the husband won't let them drive the new car. It's because there's a crazy, power-hungry group of men that control this society. And so you saw the parody of the No Woman, No Cry, the Bob Marley song, that this Saudi comedian did of No Women, No Drive. But women have been fighting for the right to drive for decades. In fact, one of the first examples I saw was a woman who had come to the United States to get an education, and when she went back home, she's like, wait, what's this about? I was driving myself all over the place in the United States, now I come home and I'm not allowed to drive? And women go to the neighboring countries of like Oman or Bahrain, and they see women driving all over the place. So they started protesting by getting out in the cars and driving. And immediately they're stopped, they're imprisoned, they're sentenced to lashes, they're fined, their passports are taken away from them. And so it's been very difficult for them to do this kind of direct action. So years go by, and then another group comes up, and they try to do it, and years go by, and another group comes up, and they try to do it, and they are constantly being put down. The government says, yes, we will one day lift this restriction, but the time is not ripe yet. Ask them why women can't drive. You can't even get a straight answer about it. Some of them say, for their own protection. And then you ask, well, what does that mean? And then what some of them will answer is, well, because there are people who don't want to see women driving, and so they might pull them out of the car and assault them. There was a fatwa issued by one of the clerics that said women can't drive because it would hurt their ovaries. And that's why the guy doing the song said, your ovaries are safe sitting in the back seat. It's no reason, it's just a reason about power. So women have been fighting constantly for more rights. One of them has been the right to vote. Well, one might say, what would they vote for? Because they certainly can't vote for president because there are no elections. They certainly can't vote for our Congress because there is no Congress. There are, because of outside pressure, municipal elections for municipal councils that have no legislative power. They can only advise. And they are not fully elected. Half of them are appointed by the king, and the other half, starting in 2005, they opened them up to elections. But women were not allowed to vote. Women pushed hard and hard and hard, and the government said, yes, we're going to let you vote, we're going to let you vote. 2011 was the next election, came and went. Women were not allowed to participate. More outcry from the women internally, more from other countries like the U.S. saying, come on, we got to say something about reforms going on here. Please give women the right to vote. They finally said, okay, women can have the right to vote in these municipal elections. That was last year. Not only did they say women can have the right to vote, they say women can have the right to run for office as well. And many courageous women put themselves forward to run. It was a very unfair fight because the vast majority of voters are men, and because, you know, when you vote, you're supposed to be able to interact with people. They could never come to a space like this because it's a mixed group of men and women, and so the women are not able to talk to the men. Despite all of these obstacles, of the thousands of people elected, there were 21 women who were elected. And then they said, all right, we're going to go to our different councils in the different parts of the countries. They get to the councils and they realize they're not allowed to sit in the meeting because the rest of the people are men. And they have to go sit in a separate area for the women. So I see you shaking your heads. It is ridiculous. It is absurd. And these women are saying, this is ridiculous, this is absurd, come on. But they are pushing hard, and the gains are very small, but at least they feel they are making somewhat of a dent. The issue of internal change is one very, very key issue, because how are things going to change inside Saudi Arabia? And as I write in the book, there are lots of courageous people, from Raif Badawi to the women who are trying to get the right to drive, to lawyers who try to defend these people and then find themselves in prison. These are the people that we should be supporting. These are the people that our government should be supporting, not the ones who are repressing them. And so I think as part of this work, we should recognize that there are people who are petitioning their government. They're looking for all kinds of nonviolent ways to make change. They've collected over the years thousands and thousands of petitions saying, we would like to open up our society. We're not even saying overthrow the monarchy. How about a constitutional monarchy, like one that exists in many other nations around the world? I mean, even Britain is a constitutional monarchy. And every time they have gone to the king to make these kind of petitions, to ask nicely, they get repressed. And so then one wonders, why are there so many Saudis who are taking up arms? Why are there so many Saudis who resort to violence? Why are there Saudis who are joining groups like Al-Qaeda? Why are there Saudis who are leaving their country and going to join ISIS? Why are there Saudis who are blowing up things inside Saudi Arabia? Because their government has not given them any kind of outlet for their grievances. There is one outlet for their grievances, actually, and that is the internet. And it's amazing how much the Saudis have been using the internet. And you name it, they use all kinds of social media. They come up with anonymous names trying to hide from the government. They use Twitter, they use Snapchat, they use WhatsApp. Anytime the government cracks down on one, they find another way to do it. They say that the internet is the place where they have their freedom, where they can talk to each other about what kind of changes they want to see in their government. They put up YouTube videos that go viral, that millions of people start sharing with each other. We put up a YouTube video of a young man who was arrested at 17 years old for nonviolent dissent, and we got in touch with his parents in Saudi Arabia who gave us footage of this sweet young boy playing with his sisters, playing with his friends, and we put it up on YouTube. And it got shared by millions of people, and we looked at the analytics, and they were almost all Saudis who were sharing this with each other. So the internet is the one place where the government does not have the ability to crack down, and a lot of these ideas are being shared. So on the one hand, you have Saudis who are trying very hard to find ways non-violently to change their government, and on the other hand, you have the U.S. and other Western countries that are supposed to be supporting democracy around the world that have been supporting the oppressors. So we might go back to the issue of oil and say that one of the reasons is oil. And certainly back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, we imported a lot of oil from Saudi Arabia. But that's not true anymore. These days, we are producing a lot of our own oil, unfortunately through ways like fracking. But nevertheless, we don't depend on the Saudis. We get about 13% of our oil from the Saudis these days and could easily get it from some other country. So why do we have this relationship? Well, I would say one of the reasons is that we have now become dependent on the Saudis to buy U.S. weapons. And think about how horrendous this is. The Saudis are the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons in amounts that had never been dreamed before by these weapons manufacturers. They are selling over $100 billion just under the Obama administration, over $100 billion worth of weapons to Saudi Arabia. And you know how this military-industrial complex works in the United States. The weapons manufacturers are very powerful. They make pieces of their weapons in every single congressional district. Then they have lobby groups. They give money to the members of Congress. And the members of Congress then say, we couldn't possibly stop these weapon sales because this means jobs in my district. And even the Obama administration says that their sales to Saudi Arabia creates jobs in the United States. It's just insane what we are doing. So we are beholden to them to buy our weapons. And then also the money, the vast amounts of money that they have accumulated over the years in petrodollars have been invested in the United States and other Western countries. They buy hundreds of billions of dollars of U.S. Treasury bonds. They invest billions of dollars in the stock market, in real estate. Anybody ever heard of a company called Uber? The Saudis recently put $3.5 billion into Uber, so much money that it won them a seat on the board. The Saudi money has become intertwined with our own economy. So much so that when the Congress has threatened to pass legislation that would allow the 9/11 victims to sue the Saudis in U.S. court about their complicity in 9/11, you know what the Saudis said? We dare you to do it. We'll pull out $750 billion of assets from the U.S. Economy, and let's see what that does to the U.S. dollar. Blackmailed us, blackmailed our government. So here we are intertwined with this regime, and we've got to stop it. We've got to find ways to stop it. And one way is to put a halt to the weapons sales. And so we're going to ask you tonight to help us to do that. This is Tig Barry, my partner who's traveled with me to many a place in the Middle East where we get tear gassed and arrested and deported, and we come back even more determined to change our government's policies. And what he's handing out right now is the telephone number of the switchboard in Washington, D.C., where you can call your senators and you can call your congressperson. And we are really begging you to do this, because I didn't mention what Saudis are using the weapons for right now. Tom, you mentioned Bahrain, which is a neighboring country to Saudi Arabia that had an Arab Spring-type uprising to overthrow a dictatorial government. The Saudis came in and crushed that uprising. Yemen, they had their own uprising to get rid of their dictatorship, which ended up in an internal civil war, and the Saudis said, aha, we're going to go in and crush that uprising as well. And since March of last year, they've been using our weapons to bomb this very poor country in Yemen. Poor because Yemen, although it's right next to Saudi Arabia, it unfortunately didn't have oil under its sand. And so it's a very, very poor country. And now it has been devastated by Saudi bombing that's been going on for over a year now. For a brief period in the last couple of months, there was a lull in the fighting because there were efforts to have peace talks. The peace talks broke down. And immediately after that, the Obama administration announced a new round of $1.15 billion in weapons, and the Saudi Arabia immediately resumed its bombing campaign in the last week, bombing a potato chip factory, killing the workers there, bombing a school, killing children there, bombing a residential neighborhood, and then bombing a Doctors Without Border hospital, the fourth time that they had bombed a hospital run by Doctors Without Borders. Now, folks, this is not only with our weapons, it's with our logistical support. We're refueling the Saudi planes that are doing the bombing. We are giving them some kind of very strange intelligence, but we are working with them hand in glove. And so the blood is really on our hands as well. And so we've been saying to Congress, look, you have not only the ability but the obligation to stop the weapons sales, because every time the administration announces a new round of weapons, Congress can stop it. It has 30 days after the announcement, during which the announcement is made, to put a halt to those weapons sales. And we say enough is enough. And we've been putting pressure on members of Congress, and some of them have started to speak out. They are on recess. They come back September 8th. And we want them to hear from us while they're at recess, and we're planning all kinds of things for them when they get back in to say, you must stop this new round of weapons sales. And that's why we've passed out these pamphlets to you, and we are really asking you, and let me see a show of hands of people who are willing to make 3 calls next week to your senators and your congresspeople. Thank you so much. It makes a huge difference. Congresspeople say that just 6 calls alone is a lot for them to receive. So imagine all the calls we can get just from this group. So I want to end by saying that we are in a very interesting time in our elections, aren't we? And we can talk during the Q&A period if you want about Hillary Clinton and Trump. Oh, I did say I was going to mention something about Hillary Clinton's ties to the Saudis. Let me just say quickly that Hillary Clinton has a foundation, right, called the Clinton Foundation, that has, until she announced just this week that they were going to stop taking money from foreign governments, they have been soliciting money from foreign governments, and the Saudi government is one of the largest contributors to the Clinton Foundation, contributing somewhere between $10 and $25 million. But not only that, one of the biggest lobby groups in Washington, D.C. is called the Podesta Group, started by 2 brothers. One of them is Tony Podesta, the other is John Podesta. Anybody know who John Podesta is? The chairman of Hillary Clinton's presidential campaign committee. His brother, the Podesta Group, is a registered foreign agent for the Saudi government, gets $140,000 every single month to represent the Saudi government. So the ties are unfortunately very deep. So whether it's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House, whether it is Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump in the White House, we are in for trouble when it comes to foreign policy. And we have to do something about that. We had a big, strong, vibrant peace movement during the Bush years. It died out when Obama came into power, people thinking, aha, we're going to have a peace president, he's going to take care of things for us. It doesn't work that way. That no matter who's in the White House, they only do the right thing when we force them to do the right thing. And so I want to end with this plea to say, I really don't care who you vote for, and I respect your individual decision to vote however way you think best. But what is, in addition, very important to do is to think, how am I going to increase my activism so that I am forcing my government to do the right thing? Whether the issue on the top of your agenda is the free trade agreements like the TPP, or the climate issues, or the issue of Black Lives Matter, or the issue of a fair immigration system, or the issue of getting money out of politics, or the issue about stopping bombing people around the world so maybe they'll like us better and stop trying to kill us. Whatever the key issues are for you, let's all agree that no matter who is in the White House come January, we will increase our activism, because it's only strong grassroots movements that will force our governments to do the kind of things that will make us feel good about being Americans, us feel good about our government, and us feel good dealing with the rest of the world. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Oh, and before we go to questions, we are passing around a sign-up sheet. We would love to stay in touch with you. And we also, at one time, had a Code Pink in the area. And we have a couple of Code Pink people here. It's open to men and women. If anybody wants to reconstitute Code Pink here, let me know.